This is another lecture created to introduce you to important principles of ethics. Once again, I am Professor Barry Penn-Hollar, and I have prepared these lectures for use in ethics courses at Shenandoah University. Hopefully, they are helping you to strengthen the critical apparatus you will bring to the study of the moral life and to the particular issues we will look at in this course. Throughout this course, we will be using what is called a case approach. We will look at specific scenarios from the context of the practice of the healthcare professions. Those scenarios will always involve some kind of controversial issue or difficult situation. You will be asked to analyze that issue or that situation using the 5 principles, the 5 basic moral principles that we are considering throughout the course. You will be asked to show how those principles are relevant to the particular controversy, issue, or scenario. Last time we looked at the first of 2 underlying convictions here. That was the idea that these principles apply to everyone. All people are obligated by these principles. All people are protected by them. Okay, let's consider the second of our underlying convictions that I've talked about. This is the idea that these moral principles we'll be using are prima facie rather than absolute. You see, if they were absolute, it would mean that it is always wrong to hurt someone, or always wrong not to help them. Always wrong to interfere with their choices or coerce them, or always wrong to break a promise. No matter what the situation, no matter what has happened, no matter how complicated the context in which we're working, these principles cannot be broken. That's what it would mean to say that they are I'm absolute. Suggesting, however, that these principles are not absolute ones, but are prima facie principles. Which is to say, they do identify features of actions that are always and everywhere morally relevant. It's always morally problematic when we hurt someone, or when we refuse to help someone in need, or when we coerce someone or break a promise. That's a morally significant feature of an action. And these principles are valid, are true in the sense of identifying for us those aspects of an action that make them morally problematic, that makes them such that some kind of justification is required for doing them. But the idea that these principles are only prima facie and not absolute means that there are situations in which they can be overridden or outweighed. There are situations in which it is permissible, maybe even obligatory, to hurt someone, even to kill them. There are situations in which it may be okay to coerce someone. I mean, think about it. If this were not the case, capital punishment, self-defense, war is wrong. If this were not the case, law, which is by its very nature coercive, is immoral. But certainly we don't believe that. Now, the validity of these principles and the recognition, however, of their prima facie rather than their absolute status together means that those situations in which a principle can be outweighed or overridden are situations in which we can appeal to one of the other moral principles or another significant moral consideration to justify suspending the principle in question. That sounds like a very difficult matter, and it is, but I think when we use some examples, you will see what I mean. So consider the idea that we would all probably accept that we have an obligation to keep a valid promise that we've made. Now, is that obligation absolute or prima facie? Some of us are probably tempted to say, well, promise keeping is an absolute moral obligation. It's always wrong to break a promise. But I don't think we really believe that. Consider this scenario, or this case. Imagine that I have promised to meet you in my office at 2 p.m. tomorrow to help you better understand course material. Now, I think we would agree I have a moral obligation to keep that promise, to meet you in my office. However, as I'm on my way there after lunch, I come upon a stranger who has been injured on campus in an accident and desperately needs to be taken to the hospital. I'm the only one around with a car, but if I take him, this means I will miss my appointment with you and break my promise. What should I do? Now, on the one hand, I have an obligation to meet you because, on the other hand, I think we would all agree that I have an obligation to help the injured person. But this is a moral dilemma because if I help that person, fulfilling my obligation to them, I must break my promise to you. Now, I think all of us would agree that I would be justified and even obligated to help the injured person. That I am justified or even obligated, therefore, to break my promise to you, to meet you in my office at 2 o'clock. But consider what this means. This means that the rule against breaking promises and the principle upon which that rule is based isn't absolute. It's only prima facie. The fact that I'm breaking a promise is a serious moral consideration to which I must give due weight, but it's not absolute. I may be justified in breaking the promise. But notice, the justification is by appeal to another serious moral consideration, my obligation to help an injured person. So, in saying that our moral principles are only prima facie, that they can be overridden, I'm not suggesting they can be overridden for any sort of trivial reason, like personal preference or personal desire. They can only be overridden by an appeal to a more important or more weighty moral consideration in the situation. Every one of the cases you'll be asked to analyze and resolve in this class, every one of the issues we'll be looking at, can be understood as moral dilemmas. That is to say, as situations in which serious moral considerations and our moral principles point in conflicting directions. Your first task in every case, with every issue, will be to identify the principles that are in conflict, to identify the serious moral considerations that make these cases and make these issues moral dilemmas. This concludes the third iMovie presentation in this Introduction to Principles of Ethics. By now you should be familiar with the definition of ethics and morality, with the different things we might mean when we say an action is right, and now with the two underlying convictions that undergird the approach we'll be using here involving these 5 principles. In the final introductory lecture, we'll look at the learning objectives related to this course.